Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm excited to be your guide on AZ500, Microsoft Azure Security Technologies. We're focusing on learning path for secure compute, storage, and database. And we're on the module number 2, where we're going to implement security for storage itself. So when we take a look at storage and that durable storage, there's a wide variety of storage types. And to make any sense of this chart, what I want to do is I'm going to go to a storage account. We're going to talk about the storage account from a security perspective. I'm not going to get into all the other features about the types of replication and features. We're going to just look purely from a security perspective of the aspects of security for storage. And then we'll come back here and hopefully the slides will make more sense. So let's go to the portal. So I've come into a storage account in the upper left-hand corner. It's just a name that I've created, and you can see it's a storage account. And on this thing called the blade, down the left-hand side, you'll notice that we have a standard set of options that are specific to this storage account. You'll see this blade structure across all of the Azure resources. Now, I'm going to start with one of the very first ones. And up at the top, we have access control. We covered this in another recording when we talked about role assignments and who can do what where. If you remember that RBAC, the role-based access control. And this is to the storage account itself. Now, when we get into the actual storage items, we're going to show you how we apply RBAC at that. But this is going to be who has the owner. Remember, we talked about the differences between the roles. Owner has the ability not only to make changes and use the feature, but they can change its permissions, who can read the object, and you can see a wide variety of roles that have been assigned to it and the people that are in that role assignment. Coming down a little bit further, we want to come and take a look specifically at a feature called access keys. Now, this is under security and networking for the storage account. Now, the type of data that can be stored in this account fall into these 4 categories, and I'll come back to that one in just a bit. But under security and networking, we have this thing called access keys. And so by default, all data in Microsoft Azure is encrypted at rest is the term that is used. So it means that when this storage account is at rest, it's not being used, it is encrypted at that rest state. And these access keys are going to be one way that you can open up or decrypt the storage that is associated with the storage account. Now, you'll see that we've got a series of access keys that are here, and you can rotate them. And when we get back to the books, they'll talk about these keys, and you should be storing them in a thing called Key Vault as a secure way to store and maintain access to these keys. We have multiple keys so that you can work on a key rotation process. Now, these keys currently are managed by Microsoft. So you take a look at encryption here. So the encryption is hosted by default using a Microsoft managed keys. Now, this was the way that Azure was from almost the very beginning. And several years ago, we had to make a change. Because when you take a look, or if you're familiar with certificate and keys at all, and a thing called a PKI or public key infrastructure, and your CA, your certificate authority, as the certificate authority administrator, you have a thing called a key recovery agent. So if someone accidentally loses their keys, you have the ability to recover those keys for them. And that's the way that we had built this system from the scratch. Now, while we would never look at your data, we had theoretically the ability to, because we could recover your keys, gain access to your data and see it. So customers said, hey, Bob, that's great. Well, not Bob. Hey, Microsoft, that sounds great. But we can't have, maybe it's government regulations or maybe some industry requirements that you have that says we can't have anybody else other than certain people access this information. So we've added the capability to say, by default, Microsoft will manage these keys. If you ever lose the keys, we can help you recover them. We wouldn't do that. But if you need to, you can switch over to customer managed keys. So now you are going to be responsible for a BYOK, or bring your own key, where we'll have to generate the keys that you will use to encrypt your data. And as you see, it gives you all sorts of options here to store those keys into Key Vault, which we basically, we recommend that you do as a secure way. And then we take a look at, going back to some of the earlier recordings, is it a system assigned or user assigned identity that we want to use with this? And so you have all these different features for that encryption. So we have access keys and encryption at the storage account level. I'm going to deviate from the course just a little bit. I'm going to show you a bit more that I think is important from a security and recoverability feature that you might want to manage when you start to get to Defender for Cloud and putting it into your assessment and monitoring capabilities. So when you get into configuration, you'll see that there's several features in here. Now, this is flip-flopped a number of times over the last 8 or 9 years. It used to be that by default, storage accounts had and allowed anonymous access to the storage in the storage account. The default now is to allow anonymous is disabled. So you still may want to monitor for this to make sure that you've disabled this feature, because for some people, if they didn't know that the default used to be to enable it, they didn't know to lock it down. So I would strongly recommend that as you're doing your monitoring of storage accounts, you may want to check to make sure that allow blob anonymous, that while it's default now, that you do typically want that not to be available. When you take a look at the allow storage account access keys, yes or no, so you can disable that for access to the storage account, those keys I showed you earlier. When you take a look at what are called SAS or shared access signatures, do you want to allow recommended upper limits for sharing, enabled or disabled? We take a look at the enter authorization for the portal. Is it disabled or enabled? So, do you have to be authenticated by an Entra ID? So there's some features at the configuration level. And we wanted then to also take a look at a recoverability piece. So scrolling back up under data protection, I've got a series of options I can work with. Enable Azure Backups for blobs. You'll see that we have blobs and containers. There are two different terms that you'll see that we start to use interchangeably at some points, but they're using them differently, and I'll explain that in just a few minutes. We've now given you the capability to allow for soft deletions. So if someone actually deletes something from a container, they can delete a blob. By default, it's going to keep it for 7 days. Enable soft delete at the container level. So this is going to be the blobs inside of a container. And that, again, you can't delete the containers, and it's kept for 7 days in the soft delete. And do you allow permanent delete of soft delete? So am I going to allow somebody to go into either a soft delete before it expires in its 7 days and delete it? So do I want to enable that or not? And you have features for version control, enable blob changing. So you can now enable some of these components, enable point in time or storage. You'll notice that when I do this, it's going to now enable versions for blobs. And you can now come up and say, I want to maintain restore points for up to 6 days. So these are some of the configuration from a security perspective. You may want to not manage it from security, but being able to access information, I think, is still security, because if someone inappropriately accesses information and deletes it when they shouldn't have been able to, being able to recover it is still, I think, into the realm of possibility as being part of a security feature you may want to enable. So let's go take a look at the actual storage itself. So we've taken a look at some of the management of the storage account. So when you get into the storage, we have 4 types of storage. There are containers, file shares, queues, and tables. Now, over time, this name has changed. It used to be called blobs here. Now, blobs, binary large objects, the people who managed that part of the industry said, you can't call this blob storage because a blob can't store a blob. You put blobs into some type of storage. So we called it container storage. And then we covered in another recording, we talked about things like Docker containers to run your applications. So the container people, you can't call it containers because that's where we put our applications. So you'll hear this feature referred to as blob storage, container storage, or blob container storage. So if you hear those 3 terms, they're all basically the same. So containers and file shares are referred to as unstructured data. So if you have any unstructured data requirements, the security for them is what we're going to take a look at. And so in the modern method of accessing the information, taking a look at an HTTP or an HTTPS communication using that modern protocol, you would put it as a blob in a container. That's how you access it. So if you want to secure the communication, you move from an HTTP to an HTTPS. File shares are, I'll call it legacy-based access to unstructured data. So this is your traditional file shares that you might have had on a file server and using Windows Server to access your F drive or whatever it might be. So this is accessed using an SMB protocol, which is encrypted, where the HTTP to access the containers is not, the HTTPS is. So taking a look at the two different protocols and the security that follows the type of storage you're dealing with. If you go back to the recording where we covered containers, we talked about durable storage for containers, and you use file shares for that access to map drives to it. So that's the type of storage we looked at for working with actual containers to run your applications. Now, we also have two other types of storage in here, Azure Queues and Azure Tables. These are referred to as lightly structured data or NoSQL data. Azure Queues are a message queue, and Azure Tables would be something like Redis Cache, Cosmos DB that you've got, that kind of lightly structured table storage, but they all fall under a storage account. So once I get a container, I come into the containers area and I can create multiple containers. I'm going to call it AZ500 demo. So I've now got this new container that I can store files in, and remember that default that we talked about, do I allow anonymous access? So over here in the three ellipses next to it, I can take a look at my container properties. I can generate that SASS or the shared access signature token. I can look at access policies, and I can change the access level. This is what I'm going to do right now. And you can see that I can't change it because anonymous access level has been disabled. If I go in and enable that feature, and I want to do that here for a second, let me go down into Settings, Configuration. I'm going to enable that feature. I'll come back to my containers, and now I can change my access level from private, no anonymous access to blob anonymous or container anonymous, which means anybody can gain access to this information. So this is something you may want to check to see, is that attribute turned on or off? If I were to generate the token, I would get a link that would allow me to give that link to somebody, either through email, possibly, not a good way, but the best way to share these kind of tokens would be to share them through Key Vault and give access to the token through Key Vault. But that's one way to get in and look at this information. You can also change the way in which the permissions are used to access this information and move from a SASS token and now require that they use Entra IDs to actually access the information. So all of these configurations I can work with. The same thing's going to happen over at File Shares. I can now have individual directories that I can now file share. Call this one AZ500 as well. I'll just call it FS. I get into the access control that allows access to the actual file share itself. I can view the access, and this is going to use the RBAC permissions that would then be based around the Entra IDs that I'm working with. Now, there's one last feature that I want to take a look at, and it's covered in the slides. So I just want to go down to the very bottom, and they talk about enabling the resource locks. And so again, under Settings at the very bottom, you can enable a lock on the storage account. This is not on individual files. It's not in individual containers. It's at the storage account. And so you can add a lock that is either a read-only or a delete lock. Now, you then have to give somebody the permissions to be able to delete the delete lock, which is what is called a separation of control. And you may want to enable that as a recommended policy or practice within your security monitoring, so that I might be able to add a lock and I can take it off, but I'm not the person who uses the storage account. You shouldn't typically want the person who creates the storage account, the person who can add or remove the locks themselves. Because that way you've got one person that can circumvent the security. So if it's secure information and that person goes rogue on you, they could go in, remove the lock, and then delete the account. You typically want two people in collusion to circumvent security. So I might be able to delete the account, but I can't remove the lock. So I got to go find the person who could delete the lock, but they can't delete the account. So they can remove the lock and I can delete the account. So that's that separation of control that you may want to have around the locks of the storage account. Okay, so let's go back to the content. So I just gave you a brief overview of all the different security options that are available to be used on a storage account. And so hopefully this now makes more sense as you take a look down the far left-hand side. It takes a look at Azure Blobs, Azure File Shares. Those Azure Blobs is the container storage I was talking about. We take a look at Azure Files with REST access, Azure Queues, and Azure Tables. We then start moving across. We take a look at that SASS, or the shared access signature, the shared keys that you're working with. It's supported across all of those resources. We take a look at the shared access keys for the storage account itself. Again, that's the second column. Third column is the shared access signature to the objects themselves. And you'll notice that we didn't have that option for Azure Files because by default, it's based around that old SMB model, that traditional file server where you had usernames and passwords that were then put into the access control list and the access control entry. We do support Microsoft Entra IDs. You see that option across them. We provide backwards compatibility to the on-premises Active Directory domain services. And that's going to go back to the Kerberos methodology that has been mentioned in other recordings. And so hopefully that makes sense across that whole component. You can see that anonymous public access. It's supported, not supported for some. Was it on by default or not? I gave you some of those options along the way. So looking at some of the best practices around the account access keys themselves, we showed you that those keys can be either Microsoft generated, you manage them, and if you lose them, we can help you recover. We also gave you the option where you can now move from a Microsoft managed key, where you can now manage those keys. You then bring the certificates or the keys that are used to and store or encrypt the accounts, and then you can store those in a key vault for its distribution. You want to use Microsoft Entra ID authentication and authorization. Entra ID authenticates the user or the resource, and then you authorize it based around that Entra ID. And the beautiful thing is, as we start to use these storage accounts more than just individuals, it's not me storing my files there, it's an application coming to get maybe all the pictures that you have of all the products that you sell so that it can publish it to the web page. By using those security principles that are managed identities, you can now assign a system-assigned managed identity to an application. It gets that application, it starts up, it gets authenticated against Entra ID. It now has a managed identity. That managed identity is used to come and read only the information from the storage account that gets the pictures that gets published to the web page. So there's that kind of life cycle you're looking for. Key rotation, whether you're using SASS tokens or even just for the encryption, is an important part of the management of your keys. You want to rotate those keys on a regular basis. Like any key or certificate, the longer you leave it in operation, the more likely it is to be compromised or be vulnerable. And so you want to actually rotate those keys on a regular basis so that you now have a stronger, secure environment. Because, someone, if they gain access to, the token information, they're going trying to compromise it, they potentially could over a period of time, depending on how, sophisticated they are. I showed you this, gaining access to the Azure File Shares. That's that second option that provides that kind of legacy backwards compatibility to that on-premises file server environment that you've used to. That uses SMB, or server message block, as the protocol that is encrypted by default to communicate with file shares. And you can see that it provides a series of options to enable for your authentication and authorization access. You can use on-premises ADDS authentication. That Kerberos feature, we have Microsoft Entra Domain Services. That's going to give you Kerberos authentication that was generated from an Azure-hosted Entra Domain Services environment. We talked about this in another recording, that if you ever had the AD or Entra Connect utility that took your ADDS on premises, replicated that to Entra ID, you could then replicate that information into an Entra Domain Services so that you can now have that Kerberos authentication native within the cloud. And then you have the Entra Kerberos for hybrid identities. You can now actually enable that feature where it's going to generate the Kerberos ticket without going through the extent of creating the Entra Domain Services authentication. Looking at the configuration, I didn't do this in the on-screen demonstration that I was doing because I knew that the slides were here for it. So you can actually change the access method at the different types of storage. And so here you're looking at blob storage. You know, what we saw was the container piece, and sometimes it's referred to as blob storage or container storage. The blobs in the container storage, you can see that on the overview tab, there's the authentication method that you have that you can switch from a SAS token to Entra ID. We have a similar feature that's going to be available on your Azure tables as well. And this is what that slide is showing you, is how to go into your Azure tables and enable the access either through SAS tokens or through an Entra ID to be able to access the information in your table storage. Looking at data protection overviews, this is that resource lock that I talked about and the separation of control. You want someone who maybe builds the storage account and then someone who applies the policy to lock the account. Now, I'm talking about it as if people are doing this. A lot of this information can also be managed not only through your Windows Defender for Cloud, who then reports on it, but you can enforce a lot of this using a thing called Azure Policies. We're not going to cover that at this point. It is a way to deploy resources in a secure manner. So if you have a policy that you write to say, hey, all accounts have to have a lock on it, and it's going to be built by the system, you could do that with a policy. But know that it typically doesn't go back and change accounts that are already created. So it's a kind of a combination of features, but you may want to add to your learning around securing these features by using policies to, at the time that the resources are created, that they fall in line with that configuration, so you don't have to come back afterwards with Defender for Cloud using the MCSB to analyze it and find out that it wasn't created correctly. So I think policies are an important part that we'll cover more when we get into Defender for Cloud. We talked about the BYOK, or the bring your own keys, that feature. If you want to, if you have a security requirement for it, absolutely. But, you know, I do caution you, make sure that you have a way to protect those keys, store them in Key Vault so that they're easily accessible, especially if you go through key rotation processes. You don't want to have to be responsible for managing those keys at the actual storage account. You want to have the storage account come to the Key Vault to get the key, and then what you do is you rotate them through the Key Vault so that it's much easier to manage. But BYOK is an option that's available for you from the default option of Microsoft Managed Keys. We have a series of encryptions that are available for you across the infrastructure components, and we'll be getting through in other recordings where we take a look at maybe SQL even. We can provide encryption of SQL data inside of a table. The database itself is encrypted. The transport is encrypted, so data in flight. We've talked about data at rest is going to be encrypted. We showed you that in a storage account where you may store the VHDs for your virtual machines that you're working with, you can use disk encryption in there. So we have all these different levels of encryption where if you need what's referred to as double encryption, you can use the infrastructure components in addition to the native encryption capabilities by default to meet your organizational requirements for double encryption. So we've now covered a variety of securing of storage information using the storage account and the options to access the information, encrypt that information, and make it safe for its long-term retrieval and archiving and use of that information. So I thank you for attending this recording, and I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.